Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, whether it's Marxism or neoclassical economics, labour is seen as adding value to a product or service. The more value you add, then supposedly the more you can get paid. So is there any evidence that that's right, or is something else driving inequality? And why is it that people in office jobs, which are often meaningless, let's be honest, why do they earn more than those working in hospitals, saving lives, or picking food, which is also kind of important? And why is inequality wider in some places than others? And what can we do to reduce it? Or do we need to reduce it? This week we ask, inequality, are we stuck with it? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. So, Steve, let's start with a bit of Marx, right? Because he says right at the front of Das Kapital that an item's value is determined by the labour contained in creating it. That would mean, in theory, that unskillful labourers would make things more expensive, wouldn't it? Because they would spend more hours working on it. To which the answer is, of course, well, you pay them less, or you automate their work, which would make them unemployed. They'd probably prefer to be paid less. So do we need low-paid workers to create things that would be too expensive to produce without them? And is that why we have inequality?
Wow, you could actually get a job as a professor of economics after that spiel. That's pretty much what they believe. And the ironic thing is it's actually probably anything. It's the exact opposite of that. You need expensive workers to get innovation. This is one of the fascinating things about the important question, raising ourselves back to a country we were discussing just a moment ago. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Scotland? Did I get the accent right there?
It'll do, yeah.
It'll do. Okay. So
we were talking about Scotland just before we started recording. Yeah, absolutely.
And indeed, in the last episode too, on the Scottish pound notes. Yeah, but one of the reasons why it began there was because labour was expensive, and you had of course people making clothing in France. You had people making clothing in Scotland, but the wages were higher in Scotland. And back in those days, you had a spinning wheel to turn your wool into thread, and then you can make it into cloth, and there was one worker per spinning wheel. Anybody who's ever operated an old spinning wheel knows what I'm talking about there. And I've forgotten who it was who invented the spinning jenny, but that was originally one device which could be turned by hand by one person, which would turn 6 wheels. Now, it took quite a while for it to be successfully invented. We're talking manufacturing stuff out of wood and getting the bearings right and not having lubricating oil the way you were used to in modern machinery and so on. But it was finally done, and then the spinning jenny started taking over the manufacturing of cloth in Scotland. And then at some point, with the invention of was James Watt another Scotsman?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, part of it.
Okay, James
another one
Watt,
of the Enlightenment.
Okay, now, that was this original steam. There wasn't the first steam engine by any means. The difference was that he had a governor, I think, to reduce the pressure when it got too high, and he had a separate chamber for cooling down the steam. So it made it far more efficient than the other steam engines at the time. That was to pump the water out of the mines. And you then combined the spinning jenny with the steam engine, and you had the true start of the Industrial Revolution. But the question is, why did that not happen in France? Well, it turns out the wages for French textile workers were far lower than the wages for spinners in Scotland, and it was simply not economical. If you had 6 French workers, it cost you less to hire the 6 workers than it did to buy the spinning jenny and have one worker operating it instead. And in that situation, the French didn't innovate. So who gets to be more successful? The one with the higher wage costs, not with the lower wage costs.
Right, the one with less inequality. And yet, if we look at where we are now, I wonder whether, in fact, some people whose jobs are replaced by automation to an extent or by mass production are finding that they have to lower their wages to survive. So say, for example, I wanted fitted wardrobes in my bedroom, or I don't, but my wife seems to think it's important. I can get a carpenter in to do that, or I could go to IKEA, or I could get a divorce. But I don't want to do that one. So it's either go to IKEA.
We know which one is most expensive.
Exactly. So let's stick with the first two. So and the cheapest one obviously is to go to IKEA or their equivalents. But before pre-packed furniture, I'd have no choice. I have to go to a carpenter or do it myself, which would be a disaster. So now automation has reduced the demand for the carpenter. So presumably, they're going to charge less than they used to. So because of progress, their skill has been devalued, even though the skill itself hasn't changed. It's just the value of those wardrobes have been devalued by, well, I guess by competition and mass manufacturing. So the carpenter has been pushed down the inequality ladder, hasn't he?
In that sense, yeah. But there's actually the interesting point about this is what's the long-term consequences of that? Because, again, if you look at the issue of the textile worker in Scotland, then, yes, they get displaced initially, but it then means Scottish textiles are far more competitive with the rest of the world than French textiles, and suddenly you're selling English textiles in France. And, of course, the real destruction for the rest of the world was when those textiles started being sold in India instead, and wiped out the Indian textile industry. But it leads to the innovation itself in Scotland leads to dislocation of workers in that industry, but a growth of other industries as well. And so long as you have enough bargaining power for the workers in terms of, then they end up sharing a part out of it. And this is actually, go back to Marx again. This is a fascinating part of Volume 1 of Das Kapital, was Marx speculates about precisely that process. This is in Chapter 25, Section 3 of Volume 1 of Capital, for those who want to take a look at it. And,
just off the top of your head.
Yeah, I know this one fairly well. And in it, Marx says that he talks about a situation where there's innovation going on, and says that if you have a high level of employment, then that leads to high levels of wages because workers have bargaining power. Because they've got bargaining power, there's a transfer of income from the capitalists to the workers. Capitalists are now earning less than they wish to earn. Their response is to invest less. The economy slows down. Unemployment rises, reducing the workers' bargaining power. And then he says you finally get back to the same point, whether the level of wages be as high as, greater than, or less than the previous level of wages. So he was quite capable in this particular section of Capital. Normally he talk about the wages being equal to what he called the value of labour power. So he had no variation in the wages at all. But there he was talking about a class struggle cycle between workers and capitalists at the wage level, where the wage could increase or decrease over time. And what has happened for most of the history of industrial capitalism is that wage level has increased in that particular struggle. So workers have been, in a sense, symbiotic beneficiaries from the industrialisation that's been inspired by high wages at various times in the economic cycle.
So long as you've got the bargaining power, obviously. Look, that is just the beginning of this discussion. There's a load more to it. If you want to hear it in full, then you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Choose from one of those two options, and we'll see you here again to listen to the full episode of this podcast, and there's more than 200 others to choose from as well. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.